This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Well, we've successfully made the transition to Bangkok, and we're finally settling in. The kids are in school, Dana is enjoying her new position, and I'm starting to figure out just what it's like to live in Southeast Asia for the first time. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who has supported us in the move, either in person or virtually, because we wouldn't be able to do this without the community that we surround ourselves with, and we really thank you for your support. But most importantly, I'm excited to get Terms of Reference back on the air. So when an emergency happens, whether it's unexpected like an earthquake or the result of a steady buildup like many of the violent conflicts we have in the world today, people tend to scatter. They scatter from where they live to not only remove themselves from immediate harm, but then to also find and connect with those they care about. This movement of people presents one of the larger challenges with delivering humanitarian aid to those who need it. But what if there was a way to detect where people are going or where they've gone and determine if or when they might come back to their homes without having to actually physically be with them? This is one example of the work of Flowminder, an organization that uses anonymized data from mobile operators and household surveys to help humanitarian agencies and governments understand the movement of people before, during, and after an emergency. On today's 117th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast, I speak with Linus Bengtsson, who is one of the co-founders and the executive director of the Flowminder Foundation. Linus is a medical doctor and a researcher, and in his academic research, Linus performs evaluations of the use of new digital data types, such as mobile operator data, to measure and monitor development outcomes. I spoke with Linus in Geneva. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please take a moment to open up iTunes right now or whatever podcast app you're using and click on subscribe. And also consider giving the show a rating because it really does help. Finally, do share this episode or the podcast in general on Facebook or Twitter to let others know that we're out here trying to make aid and development better. Thanks. Hello, Linus. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here.
Where do I find you sitting today?
In a little phone booth in Geneva at something called the Impact Hub. So it's a kind of a co-working space for social entrepreneurs, and we're a bunch of people sitting here in Flowminder, and then we're a number of people in Southampton, and currently one person in Stockholm.
Okay, excellent. So I'm trying to picture you. I made a joke on an earlier podcast about someone else said that they were in a phone booth as well, but I suppose it's not, you're not in a little thing that's red and has glass, right?
I wish. I like those.
Maybe the person in the team in Southampton has those.
Yeah, I should get a bunch of them.
So you're in Geneva. We're recording this in early August of 2016. I'm sure it's delightful and coming into the European summer there.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
You co-founded an organization called Flowminder. Why don't we just start by you telling us a little bit about that organization, what it is that you're trying to accomplish in the work that you do?
Sure. So we're a foundation. The official name is Flowminder Foundation, or Stiftelsen Flowminder. So that's the Swedish name. So we're non-profit and registered in Stockholm, but people sit in a number of different locations then. And what we do essentially is create partnerships with, on the one hand, UN and other operational agencies that have specific needs to improve quality of their programming or understanding certain phenomena, and we can get back to that. And on the other hand, we're then partnering with providers of various forms of data. So it could be mobile operators or providers of survey data, basically information and data that relays information about people in primarily low-income countries. And then we are a group of academics, so pretty much everybody has an academic background, and we're then doing various analysis and to put together these types of very disparate and by themselves very biased data to understand much more about, to get good estimates of population distributions and population characteristics and changes in populations, movements of population, displacement after natural disasters and other events.
So give me a sense of the idea. on your website, in the backstory, you talk about these three projects that were kind of congruent or happening in parallel. Was it an aha moment where all of these researchers came together and said, "Whoa, we should put this foundation together"? Or was it a longer story? What was that moment where you decided this is a service that's necessary? There's a need for it out there, and we think it's a good idea to put together this foundation.
Yeah, it was essentially, for me, it was after the Haiti earthquake. So I was a PhD student at the time at Karolinska Institute. It's the biggest university for medical sciences in the Nordic countries. And so my research was on various issues in global health and using technology to better understand and reach people. My focus were actually people at risk of HIV in Vietnam, primarily men who have sex with men, and because they're a group that is extremely hard to, you can't take representative samples, so it's really difficult to understand characteristics of the group, how many are infected with HIV or have certain problems. So I kind of came from that perspective of technology and global health issues, but mobile phones was completely new to me. So we had one surgeon, fellow researcher at the same department, and he went to support the relief efforts and basically worked in a container doing surgery in the weeks after the earthquake. And he worked there for 2 weeks, and then he came back, and I remember having coffee with him, and he was really run down. Had been extremely tough, and so he mentioned this problem that actually people are no longer in Port-au-Prince. That's where the earthquake happened, but a lot of people are leaving the city, and nobody knows where they are, and the relief is obviously coming into the epicenter area, but that's not necessarily where people are anymore. And I remember thinking that, yeah, maybe if we just follow the mobile phones, this should be a solvable problem. I actually didn't know how mobile phone systems worked at that time. I just knew that they were. So this was the beginning of 2010, and it was just the time when people in low-income countries also started to get phones to a significant extent. So actually I just started calling up a few mobile companies in Sweden, just getting hold of a couple of engineers and learning in a few hours how the basics worked. And then I contacted the two biggest operators in Haiti and got a good discussion with one of them. And the data is extremely sensitive, and both commercially and from a privacy point of view. So it did take some time before we could actually start analyzing that data. But I got the contact going really early on, and then I went to Haiti. So first the negotiations started, but I realized that I need to go there if this is going to be a successful project.
Let me jump in there for just 1 second. So you weren't, to make it clear for the listeners, you weren't going in and sort of sending out a survey or those kinds of things. You were just actually accessing just that pool of raw public mobile data in order to determine things. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry for kind of assuming that people know what kind of data I'm talking about.
That's what this is all about. No worries.
So I mean, it's a fundamental problem everywhere that you have censuses every 10 years, and you ask a bit about migration there, but it's really on very long time scales, and so we have very little information about both the distribution of populations and their mobility. And so the idea was that we could use the information that mobile operators collect as part of their routine business. So every time you call, they register the call, they want to bill you, and that information actually includes the mobile phone tower to which you connected, which is usually the closest tower to you. So that's the information. So if we look at, so the hypothesis was that, well, if we look at all the phones, maybe, and sufficiently many people have phones, then maybe that will give us a reasonably good estimate of the general population movements. So assuming that these mobile users are not extremely different from other people, we can use the phones to follow the people.
So now, I mean, I can definitely see where there's privacy issues and and sensitivity to this data. And this had to have been an incredibly difficult nut to crack with the mobile phone providers, government regulators. Tell me about sort of that process.
Yeah, but I mean, this was the first time that mobile operator data was considered for humanitarian purposes. So there was really no precedent, and there was a very, very urgent need for this information where people were located. And the people at Digicel Haiti, then the company we ended up working with, I mean, they lived through the earthquake themselves, and they were, they were in the eye of the storm, and they really saw that this information was critical as well. So there was a big understanding, but I do think that from a pure sort of commercial point of view, the leadership at Digicel definitely took a risk. So I mean, we had a solid academic background, but still the collaboration started then and there. So they didn't really have there wasn't a pre-established relationship. So yeah. So I mean, and pretty much the whole of Haiti's administrative system obviously had collapsed, and a lot of the leadership of the UN had also died. The biggest UN building collapsed. So it was a situation where something had to be done, and of course it should be done in a good and safe and secure way. But there wasn't really the time to form any, huge committees or set up an international body for.
Sure, yeah. How do you regulate this? So what happens? Let's sort of fast forward a little bit for me. That you get access, Digicel gives you access, and you're able to start swimming around in this massive amount of data. What are you able to produce? Is it maps? Is it specific analysis? You can pinpoint where certain populations are. You can tell what sort of buying trends are. Like, what kind of information ultimately comes out of this research, and who do you give it to?
Yeah. So to put it in very simple terms, for each phone, the data is anonymized before we analyze. I can give you a little bit of the picture of the setup, because that's changed.
Yeah, that'd be great. Mm-hmm.
Changed a lot. So in those days, the first time this was done then for humanitarian purposes, then we analyzed this individual level data at the Karolinska Institute at the university. That's not really a viable way to take the data out. So we worked a lot with the Industry Association of Operators, GSMA, and they've done a great work of developing guidelines. This was in the context of the Ebola outbreak when this issue came up, the access to this data. And so the setup we have is in accordance with those guidelines. And essentially what we're doing is that we're setting up a server inside the mobile operator's premises, and they are dumping or exporting data to that server. But when exporting it, they anonymize it. So they take away all the phone numbers and anything that can identify these individuals directly, so we can't go back to them. But it still needs to stay within the operator and not be taken out, because if you are an insidious person, you can start to try to figuring out who is who.
Sure, you can try to connect the dots with the data and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So the data always stays with the operator, and then we analyze it in place, and then we take out the aggregated traffic patterns, traffic statistics, essentially. So we can both look at the flows between any two parts of a country, or we can say, let's take all the mobile phones who were calling in the evening time from District X, and let's see where all those phones are 1 month later after the earthquake. So then we can produce maps of how people who had their homes, who we assume had their homes in a certain location, where they were at a certain point later in time. Let's just put it in very simple terms. Then, of course, there's a lot more complexity in reality, because people, they move all the time. They visit relatives and they commute to work, and there's a giant flow of people in and out. And the most vulnerable people, they call the least, and they don't have money to spend on calling a lot. So we have the least locations for the people who are the most vulnerable. So there's a lot of biases in the data, and also, of course, the absolutely most vulnerable people, they don't have mobile phones, and children don't, and adult or old people don't, and so on. So there's a big research agenda to try to figure out how to use these data in an optimal way.
So fast forward for me, I know I've just said that twice, but I've noticed the map that you provide on your website that you've also done work after the Nepal earthquake, right, which was just in 2015. How did your work change, or what had you learned from 2010 to 2015 that maybe it could have just been, hey, Flowminder was more relevant, and so people knew what was going on, or were you prepared, or how did that situation? How was that different?
Quite different, because
or maybe it was totally different. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the major difference was that, well, first of all, I spent the first couple of years together with my co-founders to try to convince people that this data is useful. Although, of course, there are biases in the data, but since 3 years, the topic of big data has come up, and everybody's so exciting. And now I spend all my time talking about why you should not trust this data, right?
So first, no, you have to listen to me. But wait, don't listen to me too much. No.
Yeah. No, so I mean, it's definitely very valuable data, but a lot can go wrong as well. But so that was one thing. I think there was a much bigger understanding among agencies receiving the analysis about what was going on. People had heard about the method. The other thing was that we already had a relationship with the largest mobile phone operator in Nepal. So we were there actually. So we had signed an agreement with them about half a year before, and we were actually there 1 week before the earthquake.
Wow.
To start discussing. It was both a GSMA disaster response and preparedness conference about earthquakes, and we were there also then to discuss the first technical setup with them. So that was so obviously nothing was done like on the technical side, but most importantly the legal things were cleared out, and that was incredibly important. So they did a great job of setting up a server and dumping data, and we had the formats ready and a completely different knowledge about these things, and so that went quite fast. So considering we had nothing set up before, we in 10 or 14 days we could then have analysis out on the distribution of the displaced, and that could be faster in the future if the system is already set up.
So it sounds to me like some of the most important innovations that you're bringing to the table, or Flowminder's bringing to the table, is these structures, exactly what you were just describing about, making sure that the legal barriers are overcome, and then providing a structure in this server environment where this data can then be placed so that it can be analyzed quickly. Did I capture that right, or there?
Yeah, there's so many issues that comes in. So this is definitely one of them. The being able to create these relationships with data providers and the people needing the analysis. But there's also a giant research component, and for each application, then the requirements are different. So my co-director Andy Tatum, he actually, and I didn't know it at the time, but he had actually used the same type of data. So he was the first one who actually used it for some kind of development purpose. He used it in Tanzania to model the spread of malaria parasites back in 2008. And so it became natural that we joined forces there after Haiti. But obviously, what he needs to do to model infectious disease spread is quite different from what we're doing when we're trying to understand where displaced people are located. So it's really critical to have area-specific knowledge, and that's great when we have partnerships with UN and other agencies like just doing analysis out of the blue. That's really gives nothing.
Yeah. So, what's the next few years look like? What are maybe the biggest pieces that you're trying to tackle, or are there really interesting projects that you're trying to work on, or are working on right now? And what's the immediate future look like for you?
So I've talked a lot about mobile data, but actually good survey data, so the demographic and health surveys and the LSMS surveys from the World Bank, they are usually our key data source, and also we use a lot of remote sensing data. And so the mobile operator data is great, but it's just one out of many forms of data we use, and the applications are a lot broader than just the displacement analysis after disaster. So in the World Pop project, I encourage everybody to go to the World Pop website. So it's a project run by my co-director Andy Tatum, and it provides free data on per 100 times 100 meters of the number of people and their ages and their gender. Increasingly, we're adding poverty, so high resolution maps of poverty, dynamic censuses. So we use the mobile data to make the population distribution dynamic over time, changing over time, to account for seasonal movements. And so there's a whole, the research field, and what we provide is really about how to best integrate all these data forms. And so we work on expanding access to the operator data, and a lot more studies on the representativity of various forms of data, and also a big thing is to use the data and trying to understand how we can use various form of new data sources to understand development, so changes over time. So we've developed quite good methods for understanding the distribution of people or the characteristics of people at one point in time, but to be able to follow change.
Give me a tangible example of how you've either applied that somehow or used it in a project or provided that to the UN in a way that, you know, an agency was able to say, oh yeah, this is really important to see, hey, these people move from here to here, or this is how this population has changed, and therefore we need to change our development program or our humanitarian program.
Yeah, so we're working with the World Bank in Haiti right now. So we're supporting them in doing a review of the urbanization situation. So understanding migration patterns and to where people move. There's a huge urbanization going on, and because the productivity, there are a lot of factors, but the productivity of farms is not very high, and has been a lot of competition from primarily from the US agricultural sector. So a lot of people have moved to the cities, and we're trying to understand then to where people move, how are locations of work related to where people are living. What's the mismatch? Can we improve that process? Can we improve the urban planning? By that, can we predict in the future how migration patterns might look? So that's a nice. So we're right in the middle of that project, but it's showing really nice outcomes so far, and gives a completely new view of urban planning than has been possible before.
What's the competitive landscape, for lack of a better term, for an organization like Flowminder? You know, we've talked with Data Pop Alliance, we've talked with other organizations that do quote unquote big data, or they're focused on the data play, so to speak, of using these massive data sets that we have out there, not only mobile data, but just as you described, large scale surveys, etc. Do you find it difficult to navigate where you're going, or do you feel that Flowminder has to sort of put down a footprint that says, we focus on migration and migration is our thing and we do it better than anybody else? Or is there more of a camaraderie amongst this sector within humanitarian aid and development about working together and solving problems?
I would say less than. I was actually surprised by the lack of camaraderie when I entered the non-profit sector. But there's definitely a very strong camaraderie with Data Pop Alliance, because we are one of the four core partners of Data Pop Alliance. Mm-hmm. So we're very good friends. But I mean, yeah, since the term, I mean, we were around before the term big data existed, and as I said before, then people were really skeptical in the beginning, but now it's just the opposite. And I do think there is quite a lot of hype, which is not reflected in isn't backed up by robust research, and has a very simplified view of this data can provide.
Give me an example of what, maybe dispel one of these hypes or, one of these illusions that are out there. And obviously, we're not going to solve every problem in the world, but is there a specific one that you think is especially annoying that you'd like to disabuse us of right now?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's a widespread belief, for example, that if you just follow how people, you can see also how people top up on their phones and how much they consume on their phones. And of course, that's one indicator of consumption and available resources. But it's just a very strong assumption, which has never been substantiated, that if you follow how people top up over time, that reflects differences in living conditions. But of course, that might not at all be the case. So first of all, mobile phone top-ups is a very small proportion of people's disposable income in general. It's a biased selection of people. Obviously, the operator, they might just have changed their pricing plan. There's a new campaign and people switch over to another operator. Or
I was going to say, there's a new promotion in every country every week. I mean,
yeah, exactly. And also operators, they target, quite often they target different segments of the population. So you can offer a better service, which is slightly more expensive, then you appeal less to the poor, but you get more revenue. And you might have better coverage in one area than another, and so there's a huge number of these problems that makes it a non-trivial problem to sort out. While it's sort of just assumed that it's supposed to be perfect.
Since you're sitting in a privileged position of having been in this game before big data was popular, what's the biggest disruption other than the fact that now big data is sexy, right? Big data is definitely something everyone's talking about. Is the growth of mobile networks? Is it the growth of smartphones? What's helping you to do your job better, or what's changed most significantly for you over the last 3 or 4 years?
If we're talking about the positive sides of things, I think I really like that the issue about, or the focus on statistics and data and analysis has become, I think, a much more core part of global health, global development.
We're getting serious about the science, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that in practice. It's there. I would definitely say that there's not much money invested in this by operational agencies, but there's a shift in the seriousness and in the attitude. Definitely, it's not just ivory tower researchers. Analysts are now seen as a part of the community, a necessary part.
Essential piece. I've been speaking with a colleague of mine about data scientists, and there seems to be even this sort of grumbling where data scientists need to be a part of this community as well, etc.
Yeah.
As I've listened to you speak about the work that you do and how it interacts, I'm wondering, how do you keep motivated individually, or your team keeps motivated? Because it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the vast majority of your time is spent collecting these giant data sets and then analyzing them and producing it. You don't get to necessarily be hand in hand with the people that you're ultimately trying to help, right? So do you find that that's sometimes you got to get to the field to make it real again, or is that a problem in your team?
Yeah. No, that's a great comment. I really miss that, and when I am in poor countries and I sit down with people that would really benefit from our analysis, then that's great, and it really energizes me. So in one way, what we provide is often a huge overview, so supporting agencies to be able to prioritize on big scales, and then you don't really get down to interact with the.
I was just going to say that you've removed yourself a couple different layers there. Wow.
Exactly. I mean, then we have a lot of researchers in Flowminder who go to the field, of course, and work there. But still, as being a director now, you get removed. That's frustrating.
Oh wow. So then let me take it to the next one. You said you're in, and I'm going to butcher it now, Stockholm. You're in Southampton, and what was the third one?
In Geneva. So
you're in Geneva.
I'm in Geneva. Yeah.
Do your researchers? I mean, are you finding that you're polling researchers, or you're finding the analytical capability or the essentially the human resource talent in some of these places where you're working? I'm wondering, there's been a lot of discussion about, pushing the work, down to where it's actually in the field, in where it's supposed to happen. Is that even on the table for you, or is that something that you're discovering?
You need a really good, both the data analytics side and knowing the subject you're dealing with. There's kind of no way around it. You do need both. Yeah, it's always tough to find the right people. But we're a good bunch. That's also what keeps my energy up. It's a very very nice bunch of people. But yeah, no, that is a challenge.
How do you keep the lights on? How is the foundation funded? Was it a big pool of money that you guys? It's sort of an endowment that you live off of. Do you guys win contracts? How does this research keep flowing? Is it sponsored by universities?
Yeah, no, nobody had a salary in the beginning, and now we have a part-time salary at least. But so we're funded now by the Gates Foundation, World Bank, UNFPA, a couple of different operational agencies, but it's really, and then we also have quite a few of the researchers have their own research grants, so quite a bit of the basic development we can benefit from the academic research and research grants. But it's largely, we don't have any core funding. That would be fantastic. So that's really what you need to be able to plan and make efficient use of your resources. But we don't have that yet. And so it's mostly it's project specific funds.
And you've said that essentially everyone who works with Flowminder has an academic background. So would it be safe to say that everybody's kind of straddling the fence between, you've got your academic career on one side, but this is one of your research threads or something like that for most everyone?
Yeah. That's the whole spectrum. So there are just 100% researchers who work with issues we find really exciting, and but which comes with really good breakthroughs, but not very often. And all the way to the people who just do operational work and just code and work with surveys or the much more operational part. But then we have a big bunch of people who are in between those, and I think that's something that is missing a lot, both among NGOs and in academia. Because researchers working on these types of problems, they really want to help. They have a passion and they like doing the research, but they also like to see it used. So we find it's really good to marry the two. So a lot of people are working on this from an academic perspective, but there's clearly the operationalization all the time there, and which the researcher is taking part in.
I know one of the things you mentioned earlier, it's kind of dovetails or it really runs in parallel with something I was thinking as I was preparing for this interview, was that along with the conversation of big data becoming, something sexy, something that everyone's sort of talking about now, it's also that you find that analytics and data, use of data to create actual usable information in these organizations and in NGOs is becoming more and more a standard practice. Here's my question. How do you ultimately bring your research and your findings down to a level where it's just, it's accessible to someone who's, that worker in the field or that person who really needs to get it?
Yeah, it's just being sometimes incredibly simplistic, but without twisting the conclusion. So if we're talking about the disaster situation, the most important thing is just to have a PDF that people can show a map. Big bubble here, small bubble there. It's really not the place for advanced 3D graphics or so. It's a skill, and I wouldn't say that we are the best on it, but you really need to try to simplify just to the operational need, and no more, no less.
Do you find that like an ongoing, constant challenge to be able to say, we have some really rich, detailed, nuanced findings, but you need to be able to put those, those pieces.
Yeah, definitely.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's especially on the uncertainty. So all analysis have uncertainty, and that's a challenge to deliver a clear operational message, but to also give some understanding of the uncertainty. That's a challenge. But on the other hand, and a very nice thing in the work we're doing is that it's all geographic data, and it lends itself to being put on maps, and people are used to maps. And
maps are great, man. Maps are sexy. We love maps.
Yeah, and they can have beautiful colors, and so that output format is adding a lot to the simplicity, I think, you can actually add in a lot of complex information in a map, which you couldn't otherwise.
You've mentioned this in a couple different ways in answering a couple of the other questions, but specifically, do you find that either the work that you've done now or you're contributing to a conversation where this type of looking at large data sets, finding those trends and then operationalizing that, is that becoming a standard across the development humanitarian aid world, or do you still feel like you're out on the fringe?
Yeah, it's definitely not standard, and I don't think it should be either. I mean, if we look at a low-income setting, Minister of Health somewhere in the Sahel, that's not what they should be doing at all. It's a challenge to get them to use just the normal survey data that is collected to present that in a good way, but just the basic understanding of data and being able to use data, that's the key thing. Then these so-called, I don't use the word big data, but these new types of analysis, they can add a lot, and if they're presented in the right way. But there are a lot of steps ahead, which is actually more fundamental, getting people to use data at all.
Two final questions for you, and something I've been trying to ask everyone here in this new thread about innovation. Who do you pay attention to? Are there personalities? Are there blogs? Are there research journals that you specifically turn to continue to inform your practice, or you use for inspiration to continue to innovate and find new ways to do your work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot is discussion with people, and nowadays you don't need to read academic, subscribe to academic journals. You just have the Google search set the correct way, and it will send you everything that happens with certain keywords. So as soon as there's an academic article
I think that you've, in one sentence, you've just destroyed the entire academic publishing world right there.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I'm sure it's not a hidden secret.
Yeah. So no, that's really the major way of keeping updated.
Okay, my final question is, if you think outside of what Flowminder does and the specific work that you do, is there any innovation in humanitarian aid and development that you've heard of recently, or that you're following, that you think is just super cool? This is your chance to sort of geek out. Is there new technology or a new way of doing things that you're like, wow, that's great, but it's not necessarily something that you do?
I'm not so much for the geeky stuff, actually. So I'd say WFP is doing really, really good stuff with phone-based surveys. So it's pretty simple, or it can be made very complex, but the basic idea is just calling people and seeing how they are doing. And that's possible now, and it can bring such better contextual information than a lot of traditional types of surveys. So yeah, scaling that up is in a good way. Is
there a specific program name or something that our listeners could go look up or check out?
Sure. So they call it MVAM. So VAM is the Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Unit at WFP, and they add a little M there for mobile.
Super cool. Linus, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.